Yeah, yeah. I
Okay.
know these things. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
you know, at Harvard it was supposed to be, I don't know, 6 o'clock. Everybody
Uh-huh.
finally by 6:20 or something like that. And
Uh, so let me start. I'll say good evening to everyone here who's joined us. We're so glad you're joining us with AIA Miami. I'm Colleen Stovall, the Director of Programs and Events for AIA Miami, and it gives us such great pleasure to bring someone as intellectually curious and talented as James Wines to talk to us all tonight. But first, I wanted to introduce Bernard Zyscovich. He asked me to only say he's a friend of James Wines and leave it at that. Yeah, good try. Now, Bernard Zyscovich is a fellow of the American Institute of Architects. He's the founder of Zyscovich Architects, which just celebrated its 45th anniversary with a wild party at a local nightclub on Saturday, I'm happy to report. Bernard is a true son of Miami Beach. He cooks a very mean hamburger. He's a mensch, and most important, he's the very best kind of friend. So I give you Bernard Zyscovich.
Well, thank you, Colleen. That's probably the best intro I've ever received. I think that the hamburger was unexpected, but I'm glad that you enjoyed them. So it's my privilege, likewise, to explain that during the course of this career, I've had occasion to meet some really wonderful and exceptional people, and it's in the recent years that I've been able to come across James, who was introduced to us by a common friend who's an artist. And in the meanwhile, because of our office in New York and the fact that I'm up there relatively frequently, James and I have had a lot of opportunities to have lunches and dinners and talk about the world at large, which is something we really love to do. But of course, I knew who James was before all that because I was aware of the firm that he started in 1970, which is called Site. Those of you who are of a certain age would be very well in the position to understand and remember the amazing buildings that James was creating that were basically deconstructing themselves in space through a client that he had called Best. And those of us in Miami remember some of those amazing buildings that were the creation of James. But the part that's especially interesting is that we all wish we could be the Renaissance man, but James, I think, is. He's an artist, he's an architect, he's a product designer, he's a writer, he's published, he is a thinker. And notwithstanding all of the academic abilities that he has and that he's been through, he's a retired professor at Penn and has 24 books that have been written about Site. He's had different retrospectives. He's a world traveler. But with all of that, you would think that, I would think that he would be into much more esoteric things, but I'm very happy to say that what James wants to talk about tonight is public space and the economy of means, which are things that we as architects are especially interested in. So James, we're really looking forward to seeing and hearing your thoughts, and afterwards we'll have a chance for some Q&A and some discussion.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. That was a really nice introduction. How the introduction is not better than the lecture. That's the only problem.
Don't worry, you're going to make it.
Okay, shall I? Yeah, first of all, let me say that this is a kind of an amusing situation because, believe it or not, in all my years, I've lectured kind of everywhere all over the world, but I had never been invited by the AIA, I thought. That wasn't completely true. I have, but I mentioned to Bernard, and he said, "Oh, you got to do it in Miami." So I'm sort of here because I thought I wasn't. I'd never give it a lecture, and I actually have. And so let me change to my share screen thing here, and we'll try to get started. Okay. Now, share. Okay. Does everybody see the screen?
Yes.
Okay. Let's see here. Okay. Let's see what that is. I don't know what that is. Okay, I think it's okay.
Yes, perfect.
Can you see it all?
Yes.
Okay. Well, as I was saying, there was this thought that I had never given a lecture to the AIA in Florida, and to the contrary, I have. And it's this kind of auspicious one. It was really very early in the game. We had done very little work, and it was actually organized by Architectonica. So Bernardo and Lorinda were the first very early invitation to Frank Gehry, to Tigerman, and in sight, I was an environmental artist, so I was very complimented to be sandwiched in between two of these incredible architects. So I'm not a registered architect, I'm an environmental artist. But anyway, so about 2 years later, I think the thing was in 1979, the lecture, and 2 or 3 years later, in 1981, actually, there was a book published by Olivier Bossier in Paris on the three of us, Gehry, Sight, and Tigerman. So it was a double whammy. So I not only lectured in Florida, but I've actually had a kind of auspicious start. And I think this is one of the first books ever published on all three of us. I think we maybe had some things before, but I think it was the first kind of official book really exploring our work from a conceptual and professional perspective. Okay, one thing I want to do before we start is dedicate tonight's lecture to Michael Sorkin, who was a great friend and passed away, sadly, of COVID. And if you haven't read Michael's work, everyone in Florida should read it, architect or non-architect, because he's not only an exceptional writer, but a very, very perceptive thinker and creator, dealing mainly with city planning and ideas for cities. So again, I absolutely worshipped him when he was alive. We had great conversations. He's articulate beyond belief. And so this is dedicated to Michael. Oh, wait a minute, I went down here with it. Okay. Okay, well, let's start. What I'm going to do tonight, I have this new lecture I call The Economy of Means. And what I do, the first part of the lecture will be more or less what I guess I would call my standard beginning for Economy of Means, which I really discuss some of the issues in the larger picture that we're all dealing with today. Mostly catastrophic. But I thought I would kind of go through them all and discuss some of the issues that we really discuss. I think what I would like to do, and I have been doing, it's kind of a self-criticism, but it's also a critique of the whole public domain and architecture and everything, because we're going to have to face a new reality. There is absolutely, not only post-pandemic, but just in general, economically and every other way, new reality. So what I'm going to do is start with, well, obviously, since Florida has experienced it very recently, there is this huge mega problem, which I guess is the most global and the most universal. And there's also this problem of the rich world, poor world, which we're suffering. I mean, it's an ironic situation and a tragic situation, but it persists everywhere. We also have this obsession with building mega cities, and so that almost every city in the world, rather than having personality and character as they used to have, is beginning to look exactly alike, so that they're all based on the same paradigm. And one of the problems, of course, another problem is this obsession with height. This is an article from the New York Post, why developers lie about the size of their erections. And I figure there is a psychological issue here. these probably are sort of macho men with maybe diminutive equipment or something. But anyway, they seem obsessed with building the tallest. And the funny, it goes way back to, this macho instinct goes way back to, 6th century BC. But anyway, it persists today. And another big problem, and this is something Michael Sarka would point out, 68% of the world's population is projected to live in urban areas by 2050. In 1900, only 16% of the world's population lived in cities. So this is, again, a huge problem. Another issue is 1/6 of the world's fresh water supply, 1/4 of its wood harvest, and 2/5 of its fossil fuels are used to build human shelter. And then on the other hand, billionaires have more wealth than 4.6 billion people who make up 60% of the planet's population. So we have inequities. And then, of course, we had the pandemic to boot. And then we had the COVID-19 residuals, which is part of what I'm talking about tonight, because we're talking about public space. And certainly one of the big challenges is, on one hand, you have probably half the civilizations of the world now still wanting to maintain social distancing, and the other half wants to cluster together more than ever. So how do you design public space for people when there's kind of this collision course? And that's true of a lot of things that I think I'll touch on tonight. Another issue is, the obsession with computers. Everyone works on a computer now. And as I often say, computers never had a hunch. They never had an instinct. You're completely programmed, and you use what the program gives you. And a lot of what is considered now high art of computer generated design is exotic, because you can presumably make any shape you want and build it at any scale. So that's, again, part of that excess, which also comes with a computer. Another issue under the CAD umbrella is the kind of dominating concept of style. We had modernism and we had constructivism, and now they sort of fuse together in this kind of new organic architecture. And I'm not talking, again, it's not a critique of architecture or the aesthetic. It's really a critique of sameness. Everybody, kind of growing out of the same residual influences. I mean, modernism and constructivism are now two movements that are 100 years old. So I find it a little interesting that, for example, a lot of it came from sculpture, from actually the practice of visual art. So from about 1910 to about 1950, 60, half of the sculpture of the world was influenced by industrial form, and the other half was influenced by organic form. And that's kind of exactly what we have in architecture to this day. And I'm not sure it completely makes sense, because the real influences, like this was really influenced, these images were influenced by the emerging of the industrial era and this interest in nature and organic form. So there was an inherent cultural change that was taking place. Now the cultural change is ecology and information. And the imagery of these two things, look at the imagery here and the imagery here, are totally different sources. And both are based on systems, which is interesting. The ecology is about growth and evolution, and the systems that run technology, of course, are digital and so forth. So it's a different imagery, so, a different source of influence. Getting into this issue of public space, if we go back to Le Corbusier's Voisin plan of 1925, it still dominates the way public space in cities is created. Massive slabs of concrete, lollipop trees, public art, all the. And here's, only recently, La Défense in Paris, here the massive slab of concrete, people look like little ants running around. So we have a lot of paradigms that are kind of old now, and because it's dominating China, I mean, here's Red Square. Look at the views of China. So it's a prevailing source of influence. And when it finally manifests itself in public space, it breaks down into, as I say, a absolute routine of it's either a slab of concrete, blocks to sit on as benches, lollipop trees, public art, or somewhere there's always a little squirty fountain. So it's kind of sometimes good in art or architecture or any kind of public domain to kind of rethink it all, to relook at it. I think what is really ironic and terrifying is that an article in New York Magazine, January 1st, 1980, 14 years before 9/11, they had a cover story of the buildings that New Yorkers love to hate. One of them was this Pan Am building being blown up, which is horrifying. 14 years later, there was 9/11. And among the buildings in the magazine at that time, the most hated buildings in New York and the public space surrounding them were the World Trade Center towers. So go figure. And sadly, it was a terrorist attack, but the terrorists did not really attack anything with deep sentiment to New Yorkers or Americans. And I think it's kind of indicative. I mean, here you have public art, typical plaza, huge slab of concrete, and this poor little kid is running in terror from public art. Well, anyway, just to show you, before I go on with this kind of critique, I did have a start in sculpture, legitimate, real sculpture. At that time, in the 60s, it was either, it's like this typical, it had to be on the wall or on the floor, and you don't put on the base anymore. And I worked in architectonic materials, concrete and steel, kind of woven together. And I filled studios, and I had studios in both Rome and New York. I had a quite successful early career in doing sculpture. In fact, my mother says always, because she never understood what I was doing in the environmental art movement. And but she said she always looked at me and said, at least you're a real artist. So this period ended my mother's appreciation for my actual work. But anyway, as I said, I was welding away in studios, and I became a master welder, of course, in the process, and combining materials in architectonic ways. And I was popular with architects at that time because I did kind of big organic shapes, and round shapes and round sculptures go well with, rectangular buildings. By the way, just to, since I'm probably the oldest person speaking to you all today, I'm 90 now, I want to kind of pass on some sage advice here. I guess we all, as architects and environmentalists and public spaces, are always using friends or relatives or somebody as a scale reference. Well, my advice is that I've always used scale references in case of old girlfriend. The advice is never use an old girlfriend, because as soon as any figure like that appears, and you're always showing these things over and over again, never use the old girlfriend, because I can just hear my wife muttering right now, "Oh, that slut." What you should do is always use your grandparents. It's always advisable to use grandpa and grandma. No controversy at all. Anyway, to go on with it, I did do public art. I created lots of works in plazas and for fountains and for corporations. And as I said, I had a quite comfortable career. And then I went into kind of more environmental works as I became more increasingly in the late 60s, more involved with environmental art. And finally, I have to say that I really, kind of looked at what I was doing everywhere, and it all had that objecthood. It was, somehow a specific thing. And I lived in Italy a long time, and I look back at my years of living in Italy and realized that there was an intrinsic unity between art, architecture, public space, and so forth. And that integrated element just had disappeared completely. I mean, today it's, I guess it kind of unimaginative choice at this point is the Henry Moore sitting in the plaza. And that has prevailed. And I was, part of that. So that's when I started to think about changing the fusion of art, architecture, and context when it becomes difficult to see where one begins and the other leaves off. Living in Rome, I can look out my window and see, 2,000 years really of civilization integrating, overlapping art as architecture, architecture as art. As I used to say when I lived in Rome, the glory of it all was that I spoke to the buildings and the buildings spoke to me. There was this dialogue going on with the context, the scale of the context, light and shadow, uses of sunlight, iconography, imagery, whatever. And here's a very good example, one of the most popular fountains of all time. And it would be avant-garde if done tomorrow, because here you have Niccolo Salvi melting a building into a landscape, which is incredibly innovative. But it is incredibly popular. So, millions of people, I guess, per year flock to that plaza. Why do they come? The scale references, the beauty of the fountain, the imagination incorporated, the facades of the buildings, which are, collect light and shadow so beautifully. There's so many factors that are inherent in this sensibility that are not in this California choice. So there is a radical difference, one would have to admit, between the humanitarian and the integrative qualities here and here. Well, clearly, having lived in Rome and loving the Piazza Navona and other places, we can't just do it again because we don't have the iconography, we don't have the symbolism, and we don't have the skills of a Borromini or Bernini. And we're sort of now at this slab of concrete and just kind of little squirty fountains. I say a fountain like this always looks like some kind of guilty urination in a plaza or something. It really makes no sense. Another thing that is our biggest single problem is we don't have a cohesive consensus iconography. We don't have symbols and signs and information that you can put on a building, as they did with churches and civic buildings in the 14th century. We don't have that today. And it was amazing because, when you do have it, buildings communicate. You can tell stories with buildings. The buildings are rich in that dialogue that I'm talking about. Today, what do we have? Well, in a way, this is like the social media of its time because it communicated. Stories could be told. This is social media today, and I don't know what you get on your social media, but most of it's pretty junky, and I always wonder why everybody wants to take off their clothes when you'd rather see them dressed. So, but anyway, there's one big problem, and Baudrillard identifies simulacra, which is that simulation through media has replaced reality. In other words, the simulacrum is the reality. And he's written and lectured extensively on this subject. He's right to an extent, except that under the simulacra, there are some kind of horrifying realities. There's some very, very serious social public problems. This is a public space problem. I mean, just look at some of the statistics for example, in Finland, 17 people were killed in a year. In Australia, 35 were killed. In England and Wales, 39 were killed, and so on down. In America, 9,484 people were killed in the same space of time. So we do have a problem. And, I think the wedding picture rather poignantly tells the story in the middle here. But I think it goes back to the building of these macho towers, is that it's just a lot of the men in these pictures, I think, are fearful of their virility or something. So the longer the gun, I guess the more rewarding the experience. Anyway, another problem is boring cityscapes. I mean, and so psychologists are really taking on this issue. Colin Ellard, who's an environmental psychologist in Canada, really believe that boring cityscapes increase sadness, addiction, and disease-related stress. Is urban design a matter of public health? It probably is. And this public art that I talked about before is probably also part of the problem. It's isolated, not communicating. And so when you look at something like New York, I mean, these are relatively new public spaces, all of them in New York. And they're all the same thing, the slab of concrete, the plop art, lollipop tree, bench to sit on. They're all the same. And I put the Trevi in the middle purposely. I mean, just look at the difference of human interaction. So there is a lot to be learned from the past about public space and hopefully for the future. Another thing is this thing called communication. People desperately want to have their identity in the public domain. They definitely want to speak to you. And T-shirts are just one manifestation of speaking to you, telling you their story or their politics or their opinion and so forth. I like the one down in the lower right-hand corner, and says I'm slightly overweight here. Fat people are hard to kidnap, which is kind of characteristic. Well, anyway, another aspect of public space, if a group of citizens is disenfranchised in some terrible way, they have to write on the buildings. The buildings become surfaces for them to gain their identity. So this idea, the quest for identity, the quest for being seen is very, very important. So for my whole life, I've been very interested in the element of ideas and communicating ideas and what does that mean. And Marcel Duchamp, of course, has been a hero ever since I was in school. And there are ways. I mean, we have stylistic preferences in architecture and great architects doing these stylistic preferences, but they still come from a basic single source. They still come from the industrial age or organic thinking or whatever. And so the thing I think that to what degree can architecture, public space, and landscape design serve as conduits for social, psychological, contextual, political messages? On one hand, we got everybody staring into their cell phones, so they're not communicating at all except great distances with each other. There's no contact. On the other hand, you have like a carnival in Rio where everybody's hugging and kissing, and these are kind of two worlds. And then, as I mentioned earlier, that we have the world of social distancing or hugging more than ever. So economy means, so this is the thing that I'm kind of really talking about in my preface here, rethinking everything related to architecture and public space design since the 1980s, guided by a cautious response to the post-pandemic world. And in the case of my own firm, and I think for probably all of us who are with us tonight, again, I can't see you, which is tragic. I'm doing so much on Zoom, and there is that disconnect again. But we've been asking, what, if anything, did we do right? And so it's really, you're asking the question is, I mean, I've been kind of reviewing my life and saying, well, is there anything that was, ecologically advantageous, or physically advantageous, or budget-wise advantageous? I've been looking, is there anything, or does it communicate? So that's kind of what I'm going to talk about tonight. And since I'm from Chicago, it's interesting because I remember when I was growing up, I was influenced by Wright and Frank Lloyd Wright and Sullivan and Burnham. And I remember Burnham, declaring, from the quotes, "Make no small plans. They have no magic to stir men's blood." I hope they stir women's blood as well. I got it politically incorrect now. Probably themselves will not be realized. Make big plans. That always bothered me. Why did I have these big plans? I much preferred Picasso's point of view. He said, forcing yourself to use restricted means. It's a sort of restraint that liberates invention. It obliges you to make the kind of progress you can't even imagine in advance. So I like that kind of simplicity. So one thing I'm thinking I did right or wrong, probably one thing I did right was hand drawing. And I mentioned before that computers, you always have a programmer breathing down your neck. And that programmer hasn't got the remotest clue what I'm thinking or what I'm conceptualizing or what's going through my head. And he certainly can't provide the flexibility that my brain provides. And where I'm, working with not only all kinds of references and cross-references and thinking vertically and laterally, all combined at the same time. Because, as this comment on brain, the accurate biological models of the brain include 225 million billion interactions between cell types, neurotransmitters, neuromodulators, axonal branches, dendritic spines. Because the brain is nonlinear and because it's so much larger than all current computers, it functions in a completely different fashion. And even Einstein, he did most of his work on a blackboard before computers came in. It's my gift of fantasy that has meant more to my talent than absorbing positive knowledge. So it's a fantasy that the computer can't provide. And another thing about drawing is, all my tools for life, which are here on the left, probably cost under $1,000, where running all those computers, infrastructure for computer drawing, is billions, probably billions of gallons of fossil fuel to run all of this mega infrastructure. First, it's the largest data centers in the world, consume more than 100 megawatts of electricity. It's enough power to power roughly 80,000 U.S. households. 80,000 households can be powered by one of these mega computer plants. So there is another form of rethinking. I mean, we all are totally dependent on computers, myself included, but what is it? What are some other choices? The one thing I like about drawing, as I mentioned, among the major rewards of hand drawing, there are advantages of subliminal accident. It refers to those arbitrary and unpredictable graphic wiggles and squiggles that provide a source of new ideas inspired by unforeseen residuals of chance. Okay, reductive aesthetic for communication, engaging social, psychological, and contextual sources of ideas based on the economy of means. Well, if you look again what the computer offers in terms of dazzling formal strategies and mega structures, as I say, I think there's going to be some rethinking not only of the scale, but the costs and so forth. There is sort of the opposite. When I think of what my colleagues have always done, and what I started on the kind of lowest level, big box stores, for example, was my starting. But it was taking something drastically reductive, drastically minimal, and innovating in a way that didn't cost an arm and a leg, and it also transformed people's psychological reaction to this kind of building. And these kinds of buildings, the same, everybody, just looked at big box stores and went in, bought their merchandise and went home, and they were always being advertised in the same way. And they, it was a bigger sign, you could put a brighter color or a bigger sign or, advertise it more fully or whatever. But, nobody was really doing, and I thought, going back to my history in Italy, at the time we were doing the best stores that were controversial, but going back to Italy, I realized that everything that was influencing me and everything I loved about Italy was like buildings with big facades or like waving your hand and getting your attention. And the old West of the United States, the same thing, false front buildings were a way of communicating. And so I thought, well, there must be a contemporary interpretation of this. There must be a way to do it. Well, that was the first building we did. We took the simple prototype and transformed it. And it became not only making fun of architecture, it was a critique of architecture of that kind. It had humor, which is, of course, at that time was forbidden in architecture. But it definitely put the company on the map. And as I said, it caused a lot of controversy. But people sort of read it. And at that time, I remember a lot of questions. Well, how could these people, how could a corporate company, a corporate group, hire you to do this kind of building when it's just kind of a critique of what you do? Well, I mean, I think the reason people liked it is because here was a company that was making fun of itself. Here was a company with a sense of humor. Here was a company that was self-effacing. And nothing is more powerful than a self-effacing message. It's really a powerful way to communicate. Anyway, we did a whole series of buildings. This actually was in Florida. And one of the early ones. Sadly, because of the development community and the kind of rapacious way they build new shopping centers, most of our structures were torn down. But anyway, it's using the Florida sun. Here was, kind of deconstruction, using equilibrium as a source. Again, but it engaged people. It engaged people in humor and the whole deconstructive idea. This, strangely enough, was one of the most controversial. It was a building that you touched a button and the whole building came apart. It was like a jigsaw puzzle, and people could then go in it. And it was very controversial in architectural circles, and I remember there were some devastating articles in Architectural Record about this. This is not architecture, and this is not art. So, to the contrary, not only was it architecture, it was a corner entry, which is advantageous. It was a work of sculpture that came out of the architecture, and then when it was apart from the architecture, there was a public space. So you got movement, architecture, corner entry, and public space all in one. It's not just one thing sitting in the plaza. Well, anyway, and of course, a lot of my colleagues, very esteemed colleagues, have picked up on the corner entry. That's for sure. This building was done in 1975, and since then, there are hundreds of buildings now that celebrate corner entries because it is advantageous from architectural perspectives. Well, anyway, the rejection of our work was always, what you do is not real architecture. And the other is, humor has no place in architecture. Like it's some kind of sin. And the other tags were, I was doing marginal architecture, outsider architecture, alternative architecture, paper architecture, God forbid. But anyway, what it did do, and what was funny because of all the controversy, the avant-garde was traceable way back to my origins in Italy. And so instead of doing mega buildings and elaborate shapes and massive plazas, I mean, if one thing they did, there were public art you could read from a car. It was art from the passing car, really. So there were a lot of advantages, and these are sort of the guidelines I've given myself, and I put them in all my lectures because it's sort of been with me forever, and they're very important. I think, again, since we're talking about the thinking process today, I taught myself to contradict myself in order to avoid conforming to my own taste, from Marcel Duchamp. An idea that's not dangerous is unworthy of being called an idea at all, from Oscar Wilde. And artists, to my mind, are the real architects of change, and not the political legislators who implement change after the fact, William Burroughs. So, integrated buildings and public spaces, smaller structures using regionally available materials with lower environmental impact. Well, I'm going to get into the real public art subject. This was a project we did. We asphalted over a parking lot full of used automobiles. Well, I guess the positive aspect is, first of all, these are all recycled. Everything in the project is recycled material. And it's a critical commentary of asphalt. Cars burn petroleum, and asphalt is a petroleum product. So in a sense, rather than consume petroleum, the cars are being covered with petroleum. And it is also an alternative to the future, all examples of sculpture and stored in the environment instead of being as the environment. So with the ghost parking lot, you can't possibly put this in a museum or a gallery because it would lose total meaning. So it is public art intrinsic to where it is. You can't take it away without destroying it. And even building it, putting in the old cars, so finding the old cars and installing them and then covering them with paving. And all of this was, it was organic and it was exciting and it was kind of at that time it was built, it was a media event, and then it became a public space. And again, it's a total opposite of a Henry Moore or, what I call plop art. It's the polar opposite of this. It's just, and I think it still has validity. And it's one of the things I would probably do again, because one, it's recycled, everything is recycled, and it makes a statement. Anyway, so another thing that's really interesting to me, apropos of the ghost park of that, again, in New York, in public spaces, you only have 3 options for seating. And you either can sit on a little park bench with a table, you can sit on a concrete slab, or you can sit on a park bench. Well, when I lived in Italy, you could sit on everything. You sit on the sides of buildings, on the sides of fountains, in the middle of the street, on stair steps. There were hundreds of choices for seating. And so that's also part of the ghost parking lot. It's alternative seating. Why we don't always have to sit in the same way. So that was here's a project that's talk about low cost, but it was controversial. We're doing a bookstore for the Mock Vienna Museum in Vienna, and we wanted to cut the new entrance and have an exterior entryway into that wall, into the wall at the top left. And they, obviously, the city administration, you can't do that, because if you do that, you're going to be destroying a historic building. Well, I said, well, what if I just cut the section out of the historic building and preserve the history as a piece of public art? Well, they couldn't find a real objection, so they approved it, and that was built. So it even includes the radiator. We kept every element of the project's history, and it became a work of public art, incredibly inexpensive to achieve, but it was all about the idea. It was history, it was public space, it was public art, it was a place to sit, it was part of the historic context. So that's what you can do. And this is a very quick, funny story. We had a job because the developer liked our work, and he insisted that we're going to build a commemorative McDonald's for Ray Kroc, the founder, near Ray Kroc's birthday. And the developer who insisted, he said he wasn't going to give him the property, he wasn't going to rent the property unless McDonald's used site. And so I had a meeting with the CEO of McDonald's, and I remember he said to me, he said, well, Mr. Wines, they tell me that you're very creative. Well, with McDonald's, you can be as creative as you want, but you can't change anything. So I took him at his word. I said, okay, you want these mansard roof, your typical McDonald's, looks like to the upper left there. So what we did is we popped it. All we did was make it so it's flooded. So it was the same McDonald's, exactly. All the ingredients were standard, and we didn't change anything, but we changed everything. It changed the entire attitude toward McDonald's. I mean, here was a floating McDonald's, and light entered the building in different ways. It was so attractive, it was more interesting. People liked it. You could recognize your friend by their feet at night. Children loved to play under the building. So there was a lot of public space advantages. And the CEO had to admit that, we didn't change anything, yet we changed everything. So that was part of it. That was another thing I would probably do. Again, just things. I'm just showing various things that, as I said, I would probably use the lessons provided to repeat something like this kind of performance. Again, with collage, found objects. Willie Smith was a fashion designer who designed for people in the street. That was his main virtue. As he said, I don't design for the Queen. I design for the people who watch the Queen go by. And so he was the polar opposite of Ralph Lauren. So when he was asking us to design, he was one of the first great African-American fashion designers, very big influence on Virgil Abloh, who we also worked for recently. And both of them died at 40 years old, which is a tragedy. And it's like a repeat performance of my life. But one thing Willie told me, he the last thing I want to do is look like Ralph Lauren. So he said, okay, Willie, what are we going to do? We went to the Lower East Side, where he took me, West Side. He took me to all his favorite gay clubs there. And there were a lot of them being torn down. So we took all that just debris, again, recycled debris, and we built the whole showroom out of debris that we assembled from the street. So the building became, the interior became the street, and of course provided endless opportunities for hanging clothes, for having fashion shows, for just the junk world. So it was the opposite of Ralph Lauren. Ralph Lauren would probably have a heart attack if he saw this. So it was inventive, and of course we had great fashion shows because we staged some where the models would dress and undress. So you had nudity in a fashion show, which was also a lot of fun. And so invention paid off, that's for sure. I mean, Willie Smith, as well as Virgil Abloh, we did two showrooms, his last two in Asia, and have sold extraordinarily well. I mean, they have. And then we did Willie Smith's office, totally out of building blocks that we found across the street. They were building construction on 6th Avenue. We just took some blocks in there and built his whole office from building blocks. So there are simpler ways to do things. And now this desk has become a production item. They're remaking it, and it's been at the Miami Fair actually, and it sold instantly there. So I hope we'll have good luck. We're making an edition of Willie Smith's desk now. Another place that we did that was incredibly economical was the Shake Shack. And I think if you know Danny Meyer's fortunes and the Shake Shack empire now, I think it was the most successful startup of any restaurant ever in terms of actual visual returns to Danny Meyer and his corporation. But the idea was that the building was very simple. It would be like a roadway. He loved the old roadway architecture. It would be like a roadway in a public park in New York. And the building was the menu, and the menu was the building. And so it was, I would say during that time period for 2 or 3 years, that was the most published building we ever had. It went all over the world. There were always lines out the door. The Shake Shacks is legendary at this point. The way we did it, we couldn't build in the park because the foundations were there for original, but they didn't want to tie up the whole park with construction for 6 months. So we built the entire thing at great economy of means in New Jersey. And it was all built in a factory and then delivered to the site in about 6 or 8 pieces. And the whole installation, including connecting to the infrastructure, all took about 3 days. So again, economy of means. It was very, very inexpensive. Sadly, about 4 or 5 years ago, they wanted to increase the scale of the Shake Shack. And so I volunteered. I said, great, so just call me. We don't have to call you, James. I was just thinking that I might actually charge the money or something. We don't have to call you. We have our in-house people to take care of it. They were going to double the size of Shake Shack and more or less try to copy this original. Well, I think if architects or developers or whatever, as soon as somebody tells you that the in-house people are going to do it, that it's really kind of the kiss of death. Because what they did is they enlarged the thing, hung decorations all over it, the the menu is just a little strip around the outside. The scale is terrible. Every single shred of art, any art value, proportion or anything, they stripped away. They just did a general shape into like the original. Go figure. Anyway, we went into green architecture at a certain point, integrating existing landscapes. We did more best buildings in Virginia. This where it was on a site with large oak trees and a whole forest. So we said, why don't, instead of tearing everything down and planting trees, like a typical kind of New York situation, why not include all the trees? So we just built the building around the trees. So we preserved the situation, and you can see inside and outside. You would from outside to inside to be still outside to go inside. So it was this was probably the most successful best building ever built in terms of people coming and his best owner sitting in Francis used to say people would come and bring their lunch so they'd eat in the garden, and while they were eating they remember something else that they hadn't bought and go back in and buy some more. So invention does help, and it was again very green, a green project, above ground, below ground, celebrated the terrarium level, terrarium underground, and above ground planting. We did this one in Florida was a rainforest building we do, but again it was torn down. It was a water building, but we found out just having this recycled water coming down the building cooled it a lot. It provided quite a good cooling system, and it looked great at sunset and so forth. But all of I think there's only one or two best buildings left from that period. Anyway, public spaces, people interaction, using trigger elements to create participation, collage of recycled materials and objects. Well, all of sites public works, and we've done more public works than buildings by far, because actually I'm an environmental artist, so accordingly that would make sense. But this is just an overview of what we've done. Among the things we did, again, recycling. We did Highway 86, which celebrated 20th century transportation. The Vancouver World Expo in 86 had planned to put 3 puddles, and that was it, some trees in the public space. And they had a competition, fortunately. We won the competition, so we decided this huge artery that went from the Bay of Vancouver up under the highway. So it was, it was the whole history of 20th century transportation. Again, all recycled materials. Everything was recycled. So what we did was we brought all these old objects, we monochromed them, we lifted them into place. We also had a competition between the car companies. So the car companies, I don't know, the top car, I think it was a Ford or something in the end, but they competed and donated tons of money to have their car at the top position. And you can see what we did. It went off into space, the top car. And we played around with water. At high tide, the airplane and the police car went underwater. We played with some bicycles in the pools. It was nice with no people. It was incredible with people. Because again, people like interacting. They talk to each other. And I think that was one of the most important things we learned from this project. Not only having a monochrome background where the background recedes, but all the animation and all the color of the participants, of the visitors, showed up. So people could relate to each other. That's an incredibly important point about public space. And we call it a prosthetic approach, where you're really thinking about the body and people interaction. This is a thing we did for a children's plaza, really, in Japan. And it's on the other side of the railway station in Yokohama. And that was very fun. Again, the CEO of Isuzu Cars Company, which was the sponsor, came to me and said, well, I have these great ideas. I want it to be like a Japanese garden, upright stones. I thought, oh my God, I want it to be like outer space, floating around in outer space. and I want to celebrate the Isuzu car. Okay, if your client walks in the door and wants Ishi stones, astronauts, and celebrating the car, what do you do? Well, we did it. We turned everything upside down, so everything seems floating. There's an invisible floor plan. These are all real citizens from Yokohama, casts, trees with their roots. Everything was upside down. Isuzu loved it because you could see the new transmissions, and it became an inverted plaza. And you can see this is a construction. This is casting the people. And we had whole families there that we cast to put in the plaza, which was very hard to do in Japan, by the way. And you can see, I mean, kids love to jump on their father's feet, for example. So again, it became a public space that brought people together. They interact, they like each other, and so forth. And they learned a lot about cars. Anyway, this is a project we did in Seville. Again, a very green project. This was a global celebration of the green movement and ecological design and so forth. And we did the centerpiece. You can see it's there in the center. Ours was the centerpiece plaza of the whole fair. And it was like a lying down skyscraper. It was water and vegetation interacting with each other. And the whole configuration was the shape of the Guadalquivir River, where all the original ships for the explorers were built. So it was symbolic of the place, and it was green as well. So it was water on one side, again, all recycled water, so it just went through over and over again. And then the other side was, but they overlapped too, was basically green space. And then the top was the main monorail station for the expo. So we grew all the plants about 2 years in advance. So when we finally had it built, we could install most of the greenery intact. The static electricity from the water wall ran the filtration system for the whole place. This was an interesting innovation. These were seeded earth inside of a perforated metal columns. They're perforated metal, there's seeded earth inside. So they grew out, and by the time they grew out, this is what you got. You got not only the canopy of ivy overhead, so it was about 25 degrees cooler in the heat of Seville summer, plus you had a colonnade, plus something I really believe in is people pockets, where you have situations that are arbitrary and organic, so people can talk to each other. These are in New York parks, they always just sitting in a row, and here you could interact. You could have people like the children here could touch the water and so forth and so on. Again, this was the vegetation side, and that's the water side. Chattanooga, we did the Chattanooga waterfront. They built a new aquarium, as you know, in 1990, and this is the way Chattanooga waterfront looked when we arrived, except for the aquarium over in the corner. And so what we did is we did the grid of the street to enter the plaza, and then gradually it sort of became more and more organic, as you see in my sketch, as it got to the waterfront. So toward the city, it was like the grid of the city with a large vegetated archway. And then everything came up from the paving. Everything was in the paving and either lipped up or cracked or whatever. So including the, Trail of Tears story, everything was in the paving. So you could walk and see at the same time. And so this was the entrance arch, which, was a great shade place. That's an amphitheater in the background. It's rolling up pavings for the children's playgrounds. This is the arch with all the vegetation, breaking up the paving, a water wall over the offices of the aquarium. And so they could not hear the children yelling and everything. They could see the children playing, but it was much quieter. Going down to the river. This is opening day. So these trees have gotten, all the bushes and trees are really big now. I mean, you have a huge amount of shade here. And, again, this is a project in Rockefeller Center, which is formally designed. But it's again, everybody kind of in a row, rather rigidly, rather formal kind design, whereas this is obviously much more organic, and it kind of wraps around and people can sit everywhere. It makes it very different psychologically, and this is just more shots of that and the entry fountain. Horoscope ring we did in Toyama. This is again a children's park. It was in a big horoscope ring with horoscope symbols around the outer rim, and then the playground was in the middle. And we just took the whole city of Toyama, its vegetation, its landscape, everything comes from regional vegetation. And there's a shot of it at night, and that's the city hall in the background. So you can sort of see the whole context here. But the children liked it. It's all vegetated all the way around. And you can see here, there are all little child scale restaurants. So all the restaurants were kind of miniaturized to suit the children. So, and they used to eat in the corridor as well. And this is kind of the end. I'm sort of finalizing here. This is a project we did in Italy. It's a big art foundation. And again, this is probably our greenest project in terms of construction and everything. And this is the foundation with some of the sculpture. It's a farm and a foundation, and there's a monastery in the background. And there's walls all around it. The wall comes, as you can see, wall coming down from the monastery. So it came into the property. So we just took the wall, the existing wall, and just enlarged it and wrapped it around. And so the entire building is just an extension of the existing wall. So it keeps a kind of site-specific characteristics. There you can see how it was done. Took the green, what we dug up, we put on top of the roof, and you can see there's the wall coming through. And you can see again how it integrates, how it just goes into the building and wraps around and makes the building. And it's a very pleasant, it was originally intended to house the curator of the property, but the owner liked it so much he always stayed there. And it's now a restaurant and showcase center and video showcase. But anyway, you can sort of see, and it was all done with the actual building with T-shaped cast stone columns, which we also use to kind of ramble into the property. So it not only is part of the building, but it goes to make sculpture bases. It makes sculptures unto itself. It goes all the way through the property. It goes all the way to the entrance. So when you see those T-shaped columns, you know you're part of that foundation. So the T-shaped column in the wall is the whole symbol and iconography and identity of that particular place. And then inside, we made everything in glass. Actually, the glass company was only 10 kilometers from the site, so we didn't have to transport everything. Everything in the building was made out of regional materials, either things that were recycled, or whatever industry was involved was right next door, more or less. So that saved a lot of energy and a lot of money, of course, in building it. But you could see the Swiss Alps through these glass windows, and there's opening day. You can see sort of the integration of people. And there you can see the monastery in the background, and you can see through the building, you can see the wall coming down the hill, and then it goes up behind and it becomes a building. So even seeing the monastery through the building, you can see the same, and then it's of course covered. Anyway, the language of communication is not only this. It's what I'm saying is that some of our greatest architects are obviously well employed by doing megastructures and certain vocabulary, certain aesthetic. But what I'm kind of saying today is that, that's not the only way. There are all kinds of materials we can save on transportation and materials and energy, and we'd all that litany of things that we can do. But I think it's becoming more inventive too. It's becoming a way of invention. And we can learn from history. I mean, having lived in Italy, I learned a tremendous amount about simple buildings, scale references. I mean, the way they lose light and shadow. I mean, just all the flickering of sunlight on brick buildings and details. These humanize spaces. These make spaces exciting and the places you really want to be. And even in our tradition, Harvey Wiley Corbett had this idea of layering cities. So you'd have the pedestrians on one level, the traffic on another level. It's probably too late to do that now, but it was a great idea, and it was greatly popular in the 20s and 30s to think about how we could rebuild cities in a more imaginative way. Corbett was really a pioneer, and I wish one city had done it really effectively, so we had a role model. But you can see the power of it all. And then just to conclude, I have a high rise of homes, which was, I call it identity and density, where all the architect does is build the matrix, and people plug in their own iconography. So rather than a kind of, Brooklyn Queens Expressway sort of construction where people have no identity, or the Corbusian fantasy for Paris, where the only identity is the design identity. This allowed and invited, innovation, and it was based on the idea was based on Sears Roebuck 1926 catalog houses. You could just order up the parts for yourself, and the parcels in the matrix were sold like real estate, and you could have what I call identity and density. Any city could have an identifiable group of citizens. Anyway, and it did have an influence. I mean, it's a fantasy project, and even though we had a Japanese developer who was interested, but then he went bankrupt, unfortunately, for other projects. But it's had an influence. I mean, there's one of my drawings up in the corner, but you can see how many different permutations there have been of the high rise of homes since we designed it in the 80s, early 80s. And the missing link is that a lot of these buildings that are kind of what they call them homes in the sky are still heavily designed entities. And it was the design governs what the building looks like. It isn't like the Sears Roebuck catalog. It isn't identity and density. It's designed. And I said that the difference is that our building was more or less like Marcel Duchamp's idea of taking a matrix or taking a situation and then watching what happens, which he called canned chance. So it's a kind of canned chance element. Anyway, this is just to conclude. This is a kind of, and we're rethinking it all. Somebody asked me to draw a picture of myself or a self-portrait, explaining how I feel over the last 3 years. So this is it. We all have a lot of rethinking to do. And I'll just leave you with some nice old chestnuts. These are very familiar sayings, but I'm kind of hoping that America will listen to them again, because our country was built on some of these ideals. And one was from Einstein: you can't solve a problem on the same level it was created. You have to rise above it to the next level. That's very true. The greatness of America lies not in being more enlightened than any other nation, but rather than her ability to repair her faults. And that's Tocqueville in the 1800s. And then Margaret Mead, of course: never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And so that's the end. And I just want to leave you with a few thoughts. There are other ways. You can let the forest invade the building rather than make an elaborate concrete plaza. You can break up the plaza into small pieces, and that can be the art. And so I'm really strongly in favor of economy of means, and what I call rethinking it all is another thing. And then nature's revenge, just trying to kind of reverse nature's revenge or work with it. And then, of course, doing more with less. And thank you all very, very much for joining. I'm sorry it was a little longer than I thought, but anyway, I thought I could dump a lot of ideas. Okay, shall I go back to, let me see if I can go back to where I was here. Wait a minute.
I
I'll put the thing off here. Wait a minute.
I turned it off for you.
Oh, you did. Okay, fine.
You're good to go.
Okay, so is the screen share still on, or should I can turn it on?
No,
It's
it's
off.
off.
It's off.
It's off.
Do you
It's
want
off.
questions from the audience? Or are you guys gonna chat, or what do you want to do?
Bernard and I can
Well,
talk.
I have a couple of observations.
Do we have an
James.
audience? I never know where we have an audience.
Yeah, we have an audience of several screens full of people.
Yeah.
And, my thinking is, I've been reading lately about the consequences of social media and loneliness and the impact on younger people. And I was thinking that, as the world gets more complex, and I've had this conversation actually recently with other architects here in town, that urban space and that type of relationship that we're creating for public space, all the small towns, we do a lot of urban design, as you know, and there are so many small towns and places that we work in where people say to us, well, what I want you to do is help us figure out how everything we need is right here in town, because we don't want to go to that other city to get it. And I think that you, in a way, are putting together all the things that we mentioned right up front: the art, the architecture, the cultural observations, that culture and context are first for you, and that the idea of establishing identity, I think in your work, we all might agree that you do it through provoking and through humor and through irony. And I was wondering how you thought we could do more of that, especially at smaller scales with smaller communities.
No, I would agree. I think these elements are the fact that they're missing is funny because, as I think I tried to demonstrate, a lot of them are very simple to achieve. I mean, they're not huge, elaborate, operations. And I think there's a tendency to, because of the computer, to think that everything has to be a mega statement, whereas, really dealing with the public debate, dealing mainly with what people actually occupy and integrate with, is far more exciting. It really is. And as you say, that the economy means is all around you. I mean, in almost every case, I've always thought our best things were the things where we just, pick the apples off the tree next door rather than went, far afield. I mean, there's some real obscenities that happen, and building museums out of marble, transported all the way from Italy and things like that it doesn't have to be. You don't necessarily have to achieve art. I think that was the great thing I learned living in Italy all those years, is that so much of it came from like next door, and it was incredibly inventive. But the invention is in how it was done,
Right.
what was done, and not so much in in elaborate structural systems or demonstrating technology or whatever. It was done by just finding what was available and then innovating with those situations and materials.
So I have a suggestion, Colleen. I think that because James has made it very clear that he doesn't like talking to a blank screen, I think everyone who can should turn on their camera so he can see people. And secondly, I think we should open it up for some questions so that we can get more people involved. I think it's been a very stimulating critique. I'm sure we have a lot of responses ready. So, Colleen, do you want to manage the hands up or call on people?
Sure. We do have some questions in the chat. Do you want me to read that?
Sure.
Okay. How do you encourage or advocate for these amazing public spaces to be preserved and not demolished through the decades? Sad to hear that some of these amazing projects are no longer.
Well, that's one of the mega problems I guess we all face. Well, that's why I told the Shake Shack story. I mean, it's just amazing how you could take a simple structure like that was done incredibly inexpensively. It told the story well. It became a world icon. And then somebody takes what they think is the same thing, blows it up and completely destroys it. So it has absolutely, you can take all the art out, and it's just sad. I had never known. Well, they've done a lot of that in Chattanooga. Chattanooga, there's a lot of it they couldn't move, so it stayed there. But there's these committees that don't have sensibility, or they don't understand what they've got, or they don't understand why people like it, and they just change it arbitrarily for either political or social or whatever reason, and very often destroy these things. I mean, it's just, we've had so many things destroyed during our life. And it's so sad because now we have this rash of exhibitions and requests for this and that. But, most of it's going to be shown, with photographs and the models and things. But it would be great, to have, one perfectly intact mega project somewhere. I mean, Chattanooga would be a good one, or Canada, or somewhere. I mean, the Canada project was torn down by a Japanese developer who wanted to do some kind of commercial center there, tore it down, and then never built the center. So they lost the public space and they lost the economic, advantages. So, I mean, there's things like that just blow your mind. But I think that the sad part is that you're right. Whoever asked this question, there is this. And I don't know what to do to prevent it. I mean, once a thing is in the public domain, for example, the Sainsbury wing by Venturi and Denise Scott Brown is now being threatened by changes. And in defense, they got a lot of very prominent leaders and writers and others. A lot of us wrote letters to the Sainsbury administration, and my letter was basically very simple. I just said that, why is it that you feel at liberty to destroy the art of the building, and yet you'll do anything to put even the slightest scratch on the contents of the building? God forbid anybody touch one of the paintings or the sculptures or knock something off its pedestal. I mean, you would have apoplexy, and yet you are willfully setting it up with a less talented designer to destroy the aesthetic of the architecture. And it is a strange thing. It's just architecture and public space are not sacred. They really aren't. There's no one to protect it like visual art. It's funny. We have a lot of drawings in collections, museum collections, and the extreme they go to protect your drawing of something they've torn down. It's really weird.
Colleen, any others?
I don't see any more in the chat. Does anybody else have any questions or comments? Tim or Angel or anybody?
Hi, this is Sue. Thank you for the lecture, James. And I have a question. So of all your amazing work, is there anything you designed but that never built? And you really proud of the design, or really like the design? Just curious.
I'm not sure I understand the question. Say it again.
Okay,
She
sorry.
wants to know if you're regretful of not having executed any design you're especially proud of.
Yes.
That didn't get built?
Yes, that's what she means.
A lot.
Like all of us, right?
Well, I guess the Frankfurt Museum was, we didn't win the competition. We got recognition a lot, but it didn't get built. And no, we have a number of things that I wish had gotten constructed. That definitely. There were best buildings. There was, the parking lot building, and there were a few of the best buildings that didn't get built either. No, we've had, like, I guess every architectural or design firm, you get a lot of things that never quite get off the ground and never get built. But it'd be hard to, look at off the top of my head to say what, because, it's, I think the Frankfurt Museum was one of the biggest disappointments. And I think the parking lot building probably. And I would say those are two that come to mind anyway.
Angel, you had a question?
James, and good evening to everyone. Thank you, Colleen, for letting me back in. I'm used to getting blocked.
Purely accidental.
Not a problem. James, your presentation tonight has been exquisite. You've not only conquered the ability to design and to change people's lives, but you've also found the fountain of youth. I do have to ask you a couple of questions, but the first one is, how in the hell have you kept that hair?
And everybody asked me that. It's like I did something. I just lucked out, I guess. Most of my parents had full heads of hair, so I guess. But yeah, it does stay there somehow.
Well, that's great. That's great, because I'm certain it has helped you convince many, many clients of your ability to keep things in place. I do have to say a couple of things. Your work is out of this world. This is a very difficult subject, why we as architects and our work is not respected throughout the world. I think it's time we all wake up. I know there's a lot of people on this program, and I think that one of the things that I've begun to say and that you're going to hear more often is that we as architects provide one of the most important necessities for human life. We've been doing this since the beginning of time, and it's not food, it's not air, it's not water, but it's shelter. And the world has forgotten this.
No, you're absolutely right. Yeah, it's one of the, I mean, you could make your whole mission in life just tackling this problem. Well, the Sainsbury Way is a good example, just one example, but it is terrifying, the lack of respect, or if the respect is somehow disconnected from the actual service that you're performing. It's really true. Well, it's very it's criticism. Oh, James, you're not doing real architecture. Why am I not doing real art? It shelters people. It was inexpensive. It didn't break the bank. People liked it, and they went in and they used it. Now, why is that not architecture?
Exactly.
I have no idea. I mean, no, I should add. I should do a whole lecture and invite you and we have a discussion, because that is the biggest question. I just can't understand what happens. And what's terrifying is, as a sort of scholar of Italy and Rome, and having lived there for a decade, I mean, every time I go there in the old days, I was, taking groups around, and I mean, going to the Campidoglio and see how much damage they just did to Michelangelo, for God's sake. I mean, how can you possibly revise Michelangelo? I mean, it's just beyond belief. I mean, I find out all the things they changed that he had put in there. And I have a scholar who's just a Michelangelo scholar who went to the one who was doing a study of the Laurentian Library, and he had permission to look at all the original drawings that Michelangelo had done. And he said it was just absolutely terrifying, all the things that were in there in the beginning that did not appear or were removed or changed or altered or whatever. Again,
I have another question here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, from Darlene. In your opinion, why are the... I'm sorry?
And thank you for your compliments, but your question was absolutely soulful.
I think this would be the last one. In your opinion, why are the Europeans more willing to have art and useful, beautiful space in their buildings, etc.?
Well, I'm not sure that applies to every generation. I think, I showed historical examples that achieved those things. But even in Italy, I've had conferences that moved to a shopping center and or something, or to a, Holiday Inn or God knows what. I mean, all over the world. I mean, I guess it's a post-industrial phenomenon, but an awful lot was built with absolutely no aesthetic integrity at all, or no purpose. And I think first of all, I think it's disrespectful of people, for one thing, but I think it's just one of those symptoms of that they think economics has a lot to do with being unimaginative. I don't know how the two got separated. That's the question in my mind. I think historically, I mean, you can go to almost all the great cities that we love. I mean, look at somebody like Italy. They have to collect billions of dollars every year of people who just go to look at it, just to see the beauty of what was done. And I have a friend in Florence. I've gone all over Italy, and he's always said, "Oh, you got to visit me. You got to visit me." I said, "I've been to Florence hundreds of times." I said, "Okay, I'll come to Florence to visit you if you show me something in Tuscany that I've never seen before that blows my mind." And he always pulls it off. He always shows me some little hill town or something that just blows my mind. You can't imagine somebody had the imagination to think of it. So, it was a tradition. One time in Venice, all the restaurants were closed somehow to strike. All the big restaurants and the official ones were closed. And so my friend was, we'll go in the back streets and we'll find a little restaurant. We'll find some family restaurant. So we went there. I started looking around. I said, my God, these back streets are unbelievable. They're so beautiful. Look at all the stuff. Oh, what's going on? And I said, how did this happen? And he said, well, when Venice was being built, no matter how humble or how poor you were, if you had any resources at all, you always wanted to show something about where you lived that showed how cultural you were. And so it was just simple statements of people. And, go figure. I mean, we live in a different world. I mean, it's just that show you how cultured I am.
That's beautiful. That's a beautiful sentiment.
It looks like we have one last question
Certainly.
from Hella.
Yes. Hi, James. It's great to meet you.
Hey, Holly, how are you? Oh my God, welcome. Thank you. Great to see you.
I got my hurrah. No, I got my hurrah.
Yes.
Oh.
It's always great to hear about you and your work. I'm kind of obsessed with your design and your work.
Well, okay.
Hala, we're having trouble hearing you.
Yeah, I try to. Your sound is something funny with it.
Hear me? Sorry.
Yeah.
You hear me? Sorry. I said I was excited. I thought you were in Miami, so I was very excited to see you. You know how much I am your fan, and I'm kind of obsessed with your work. So I'm following James for a while, since ever. So I have one question that what do you recommend for a design studio that I know you're a fan of work by hand, but now that the students, we know they want to go to work outside, and the outside world wants digital and software, all these things. But how can we teach them, kind of make this balance in the design studio, that to teach them also work with hand and the computer? How can we make this balance to students to use both, or which direction should we lead? Because there are a lot of discussions in faculties here at University of Miami where I teach, that should we mandate AutoCAD or drawing with hands, or what should we do?
Well, the point I was making is that no matter what, it's a great tool. We have endless great tools. And, I have a lecture I do on tools for young people. And I show a whole chart of tools that we use, planes and saws and hammers and nails and screws and everything that come from ancient Egypt, 3,000 years old. We still use them today. 3,000-year-old tools, and they're practically exactly the same design 3,000 years later, and we still use them. Computers are great, but they're not the only thing. They cannot do lateral, vertical, horizontal. They can't do multiple layered thinking conceptually. Once you get the idea and you want to refine it and start thinking, but if you depend on the programmer to make the moves, I just think there's something lost for me anyway. I don't know if it's true of everyone. There's just something lost. I just can't put my finger on it. It's just an instinctual element that I think is incredibly important. And it's and I use computers every day. I use it all day long, like everybody else. But when I sit down to think, which I've been doing, I was just doing this morning. I was drawing all morning. When I sit down to think and conceptualize, and even though this is a project where we have a lot of computer drawings already, I'm going back and saying, well, it's not quite right. The proportions, well, this, and how's it going to look in the sunlight, and how's it going to look in the nighttime? And I go through all of these things, and then I think I do all these little wiggly lines of different contours, and would it be better this way or that way? And all of that takes such a short time. While I'm drawing it, when I'm doing it by hand, it takes seconds. Whereas I'm doing my computer, I always have to load up something. Anything you do in the computer, you have to load. And that download, I was telling students, I can cover a whole page with drawings in the time it takes you to download. And it's just I feel nervous having a programmer breathing down my neck. I just always feel something may be missing here if I just depend on, even though I depend, and it's a great tool. But it's like a hammer. You can't live without a hammer, and you can't live without a saw. You can't live without a computer. But that doesn't mean that you have to throw out all the hammers and the saws and everything just because they don't look good, or you think they're obsolete or something. They're not. They're really not. I was welding. I've been welding, my whole life. I'm a master welder. Interesting. And I can do anything with welding. And welding's just the same as it's always been. That's the same principle. Doesn't go away.
Well, James, thank you so much. We need to wrap it up for this evening. We appreciate so much your giving of your time. This was fascinating. And thank you, Bernard. Did you have any last question or statement, Bernard, that you wanted to give?
Well, I think that we just had a demonstration of a Renaissance person. And a person who thinks across different platforms, and we should all do that because we were all trained to do that. But as Hale says, you end up with a moment where you're being asked to make a choice, and there really is no choice. I don't think life is either or. I think it's both and we should always remember that it's additive, not deductive. And we thank you so much for the time that you gave us, James, and I'm sure we're going to see you here in Miami soon. So
I hope so.
We're going to take that as a direction.
I'm handicapped. I can't travel much. I did go to Harvard, but it was kind of an ordeal. My God, it was like.
Well, this is a lot warmer than Harvard.
Much nicer, much nicer than Harvard.
We'll figure something out.
That I'm sure, in terms of entertainment. But it's very funny because I had some young kids who I know, two young Chinese people, and they're just wonderful. And they treat me well. And they drove me to Harvard and, kind of picked me out and put me down over there. But they were drove all over Boston, all over Harvard. And I said, this is, and they're from New York, so they see New York. I said, this is kind of boring. So then I had some medical problems, so they rushed me the next day to the emergency entrance of the hospital. And then we got out of it was okay, everything was fine. And then we saw all of the activity in front of the emergency entrance, and it was phenomenal. We couldn't leave. It was so exciting. It was so animated. It proved public space and public activity. we were watching this for 2 hours. And then finally said, shall we get deck chairs and just sit here? And then my friend Han said, this was much more entertaining than Harvard and Boston. And it's
Uh,
really
Okay, well,
all right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, AIA, for inviting James, and I'm sure
Oh,
we'll all
thanks.
see each other soon.
Thanks and good night. And
Good
there will be
night.
a recording of this program available. And I will email everybody with that. And thank you so much. Have a great night.
Good
Okay.
night.
Bernard,
Bye.
thanks, Colleen. Thanks for everything. Okay, good night, all.
Good
Thanks.
night.